Sound check 2, clerk's laptop. Sound check 2, November 18th.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's 9:30. We have quorum, although barely. There's a couple of members are not able to attend because of scheduling conflicts. But this is the 20th meeting of the Audit, Finance, and Administrative Committee. I would like to call the meeting to order. Members of the public are advised that our meetings are webcast live by the City of Hamilton and temporarily archived on the city's website. As well, a reminder that all electronic devices are to be switched to a non-audible function during committee meetings. Members are reminded of the 5-minute time limit, which will be adhered to during the meeting, and members can submit another request to speak if they require more time to ask questions or make comments. So as I said earlier, quorum is present, and we'll move on now to Madam Clerk. Are there any changes to the agenda?
Yes, Mr. Chair, there's one added notice of motion, item 12.1, which is the Ancaster Memorial Arts Center fit-up costs.
Thanks very much. Can I have a mover or seconder to approve the agenda as amended? Moved by Vanderbeek, seconded by Johnson. All in favor? That carries unanimously. So we'll now do declarations of interest. Is there any declarations of interest? Seeing none, we'll move on to the approval of the minutes. Can I have a mover or seconder to approve the minutes of November 4th meeting? Moved by Pearson, seconded by Johnson. Discussion on that? Seeing none, all in favor? Move on to consent items. This is a committee against racism, and there was no quorum present. So I just need a mover and a seconder to receive the consent item 7.17. Moved by Vanderbeek, seconded by Pearson. All in favor? And that carries unanimously. Presentations. This is on the Fraud and Waste Annual Report. And I'd like to call on Charles Brown, City Auditor, is here to provide committee with a presentation. Charles, welcome. And you want to share your screen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we're here to present our annual fraud and waste report. The purpose of this report is to cite all the whistleblower fraud and waste matters that came to our attention during the period, as well as items that we dealt with that were outstanding from previous years. It covers the period from July 2020 to June 2021. While most of the matters were reported to us through the third-party hotline, there were some that came to us directly, and this report does include all of that activity as well. Hotline is an independently run confidential service that where the general public or employees of the city can report suspicions, wrongdoing, or make complaints about waste. It's available 24/7. It's accessible online through the phone, email, even regular mail. Reporters can report their concerns to our independent third party, either choosing to identify themselves or they can remain anonymous. The city auditor office receives reports enters these reports and uses the case management system that is supplied by the vendor as well. For the reporting period, this last reporting period, we received a total of 80 reports, which is a number that continues. Last year, for example, we had 85 reports. And we continue to see that trend even in the first 3 months of this following year, from July through September 2021. We're seeing that trend continue with 27 reported complaints. So clearly the hotline is well used. Overall, with the reports that have been closed this year, the substantiation rate is 32%. That's very close to, for example, the city of Ottawa substantiation rate, 33%, but quite a bit greater than the city of Toronto's at 9%. These numbers do vary from year to year. So slide 4 shows a breakdown of the different types of issues making up the reports that we receive. The highest area, besides the multiple types, which obviously include many of these together, the highest types are time theft, forms of misconduct, social services frauds, which generally get referred, and service complaints and conflicts of interest. The notation or category out of jurisdiction, that refers to situations that are reported but are not related to our function. It could be a criminal matter, for example, that has nothing to do with city services, in which case we simply report it to the police for their information. The next slide shows a breakdown of reports made by employees. 59% were made by employees compared to reports from the public.
Charles, you keep cutting in and out. You may want to just shut your camera off while you're doing the presentation.
Okay, thanks for the advice. I have to go back out and stop sharing for that. It's disappeared, but are you still seeing me?
No, well, we can't tell because the presentation's
Oh,
up.
okay.
But
Right.
you're loud and clear now.
I can still
Okay.
see you at the top of my screen. Thanks, sir.
Okay, just a second.
Just keep trying then, Charles, and I'll let you know if
Okay.
it fades out.
Okay, all right, thanks. I should go back with one point about that. So about the ratio of employees to non-employees, actually, this is the reverse of last year. So last year we had a greater percentage of reports coming public, and so now that's flipped around.
Charles, you're still cutting in and out, and
They
the
better
clerk just suggested you just unplug your headset and then plug it back in again, maybe to reset it.
stopping video.
Your video is off now, which is good.
All right. How's that?
That's good. You just need to reshare your screen now.
So of the 80 reports, 23 or 29% were made directly to our office. So that means that 57 of the reports, or 71%, actually came in through the third-party hotline. When we receive them directly, what we do is we enter them ourselves into the case management system that is supplied by the third party. So it's still a useful service to have. That comes along. It enables administration of all our cases. It maintains files on the evidence gathering and tracking status and statistics and whatnot. Slide 7 shows the action taken on the complaints that came in. 28 were referred to business areas, including human resources, for example. What we do is we advise the area on the nature of the complaint, and we ask for a review by them and a written response, and then we evaluate that response. So that's 28. 19 were referred with no further action taken. We don't require to know what action was taken, and 15 cases were either not enough information provided to act, or it was an area that we didn't have jurisdiction for. And then 18 cases, we actually launched investigations that we conducted ourselves. And then the 18 investigation we launched this year, plus 6 that were carried over from prior years, makes up 24 investigations handled this year. Slide 8 shows the disposition of our cases for those that were solved, 80 from the current year, and the 16 actual cases that were carried over from the previous year, total 96. And out of that, 27 were substantiated. Removing the ones that we don't know about, the ones that are in progress, that's a substantiation rate of 32%. Slide 9 shows the outcomes specifically related to our investigations and referrals. There were 8 terminations, 1 disciplinary action that was not a termination, and then there were 5 other types of actions. The total value of the loss that we estimated was $235,000 for the year. We did manage to bring recoveries to recovery. So that brings the total accumulated amount since inception of loss or waste to $439,000. So the next couple of slides are just going to briefly cover some of the reports. We have some examples in our report of the cases. One case involved charging costs, the costs of unrelated projects to projects that had unspent funds for policy. And we found some non-compliances with the Construction Act. And this was, you've already seen this issue. It was reported as part of our roads audit. We included it for that investigation in that audit. Another case involved city crews working on the approach and curb and sidewalk in front of a city employee's residence. Again, we reported that to this committee earlier in the year. There was a conflict of interest situation with city employees, 3 city employees who were socializing and receiving gifts and hospitality from vendors. There was a case of theft of inventory that resulted in an audit this year to identify systemic issues associated with inventory management. There was an incident where a citizen reported to us damage to city street that was caused by a contractor. So
Excuse me, Mr. Chair.
and we're currently pursuing.
Excuse me, Charles. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think it's your positioning to the microphone. It's like, I don't know if you're moving, but you every other word is I'm missing it. So I don't know if it's just your positioning, because you're not. I don't see any of the spinning happening on your screen. So I don't believe it's your bandwidth. I believe it's just your positioning. So I'm only hearing like every third word, and this is really important. I don't want to miss anything.
Yeah,
How's
Madam
this?
Clerk,
Maybe.
just a second, Charles. Madam Clerk, you have a comment on this?
Yeah, through the chair, Charles, maybe unplug your headset and try, because I was watching earlier and I thought the same, but I don't think you're moving from your microphone, although that's what it sounds like. What if you just unplug your microphone and try to speak that way for now, but you'll have to speak a little louder and we'll see if that works any better.
Okay. How's this?
Sounds good for now. We'll let you know how it goes on. Thank you.
I had the microphone jammed up to my mouth trying to make it louder, but maybe that doesn't work. Might be counterproductive. Okay, so the next one was personal use of city vehicle complaint we received about an employee taking advantage of their access to a city vehicle that resulted in high personal use. That actually led us to investigate a little bit more and led us to launch an audit, which will be completed early next year and will be reported to this committee. Finally, we also had a report that when we looked into it, we concluded it was vexatious. So one of the benefits of having the hotline process is that it provides us with an opportunity to identify recurring or emerging issues. In the front of our annual report, you'll see that we have provided some commentary on one issue that we think needs to be addressed. In the last 2 years, we've had no less than 10 conflicts of interest investigations. And so we believe that's an important enough area to highlight in this report. Now, what we're talking about here is conflicts of interest by employees, either conflicts that are not being reported and should have been, or they're not being properly addressed if they are reported. That's the two types of situations. Some of the causes that we attribute this, the need for clarity in the policy, the need for guidance, the lack of any objective adjudication of the conflict situations, the various ones that arise. So we're recommending to senior leadership that they review the current processes for improvement. Finally, just like to say that the hotline continues to be well used. We are identifying issues, both individual and systemic, that wouldn't otherwise get addressed. As you know, the hotline was a pilot project for 3 years. And this is our final year, after which we will evaluate the efficacy of it, make a recommendation to council whether to make it permanent. In our committee report, we have made a request to extend the contract with the current hotline vendor. That's because the contract expires in May, and we'll need an extra year to, well, first of all, finish off the full 3 years of activity, which takes us into July, and then doing the evaluation of the pilot, and then either going to market again to continue or wind down the operation. The vendor has told us that they would be willing to extend the contract at the same terms and conditions and annual costs. And the financial impact is that the total spent on this, even including that fourth year, added year, would still be well within the total approved by council. It would still actually come under by about $35,000 from the approved $94,500. So lastly, I would just like to I'd like to thank the citizens and employees who took the time to use the hotline and report their concerns. And I'd also like to express our appreciation to staff and management who've cooperated with us in responding to hotline reports that come in. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Charles. And if you just take your presentation down now so I can see the grid. And but just while you're doing that, it's interesting to see that you've had a significant uptick now on the use of the hotline and the whistleblower. When we first started it, we got very little response, but now you're up to 80, which is quite significant, and you know, significant savings that we're seeing as a result of it. So I'll open it up now. See the grid's up. Does any member of the committee have any questions? Councillor Johnson.
Thank you. And Charles, you could probably put your video back on. I don't believe it was your bandwidth. So thank you very much for the presentation. It was very enlightening, and I'm fully supportive of the hotline. I heard you say vexatious on a few things, but other than that, it seems to be well worth it. So my question, I have a couple actually. So Charles, when you talk about the employee conflict of interest, can you give me some examples of this? I know as decision makers, we have to declare a conflict. Especially when it comes to money and capital projects, et cetera. Can you is there any examples of this conflict of interest you referred to?
And just before you answer that, Charles, I just want to be sure that we don't identify any individual. If we need to,
Oh, correct.
we'll go in
No.
camera for that.
Generalization only.
Okay.
Through the chair, yeah, I can make some general comments about that, particularly with respect to the policy. Some conflicts tend to be fairly obvious, a mother, father, spouse, son or daughter. Um, that would be more typical, the example that I raised earlier, where it may get reported, but it's the issue with that type we're finding is it properly dealt with and mitigated in the circumstances. Then there's a second type of conflict that's more problematic, perhaps at least in the number of cases that we're seeing. And it's something described in the policy as having a significant social relationship. And I think that strains people's ability to understand what that means. It could mean all kinds of things depending on the situation. And I think we need to have a policy that expresses to people that you're not the one deciding the conflict or whether it's a significant social relationship. It's best always to report that to an objective third party, your superior, or even better to leaders in the organization, so that it can that relationship can be properly assessed using prior precedents, for example. So that's a very problematic area, and we've seen a number of those both last year and this year, the significant, so-called significant social relationships. It's difficult to understand, admittedly, so I think that's an area that needs some clarification.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so that takes care of that question. Thank you very much. The other question I have is when you talk about gifts, and I believe that as an elected official, constantly turning away people who are bringing in gift bags and stuff because I just don't accept any of them. So do gifts also include invitations to dinners, events, and things like that? Would that be considered a gift?
Correct. Yes. Well, hospitality, gifts or hospitality.
Well, that's very clear for me. So are all the, is this really, really spelt out clearly to everyone that invitations to dinners, invitations to galas, invitations to events, freebies are considered gifts? And is there a limit? I know that there's someone told me somewhere that $25 or more is considered
Correct.
bad. $25 and under is not considered bad.
Gifts under $25 are considered appropriate or allowable. Over $25, not. The
Okay,
problem
that's
under 25, though, is the frequency with which you accept them from friends. So,
so a $25 Tim Hortons card coming to my office every day for the whole year is not appropriate. No, I understand.
Exactly. So,
And for the record, I don't accept any gifts whatsoever. I'm just asking because I've heard that there are organizations that have these events and they bring out the counselors, they bring out staff, and it can be perceived as a gift. It could be perceived as not right. So that's good to hear. So is the policy very clear about gifts? I mean, I really think that has to be sent back out again.
I think the policy is fairly clear, at least on the threshold. It doesn't deal with the issue of frequency, though, that I just mentioned. That's one area. And I think the other thing about the policy is I just think it needs to be, the importance of conflict of interest reporting needs to be elevated quite substantially to get the message out that this is important for disclosure to take place and for that to be properly adjudicated. I think those are the key elements.
So, Councillor Johnson, you're at your 5 minutes. And,
last sentence. I totally agree, Charles. I really believe perception is everything. Thank you very much for your time.
Good questions. Thank you. Anybody else? Councillor Vanderbeek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, through you to Charles, I have a question that sort of falls along the same lines as Councillor Johnson's question. How often, and you may or may not know this, it may have to go to someone else, how often are staff reminded of the, sometimes changes to, but of the code of conduct and of the policies about conflict of interest? Is that something that's done regularly?
We sign off on the code, employees sign off on the code of conduct at large every year. But within that activity, I'm not sure that conflicts of interest per se are elevated as to the importance of it. And maybe one of the things that I've seen in other organizations that I've worked for that seems to be more successful in elevating its importance is that the senior most leader of the organization every year would write a letter to all employees saying that they must disclose conflicts of interest to them. And then they received these and they would turn them over typically to someone in legal to assess for whether or not they're a conflict, and you're expected to supply your own suggestions for mitigation with which they may agree or disagree and add further elements of mitigation to that situation. So through that process being both elevated and also centralized and adjudicated by people that do it all the time, you build up a repository of precedent as to how to judge these situations. So that's in the best jurisdictions that I can think of, that's what happens.
And so, thank you very much. And so, Mr. Chair, through you, I'm understanding that we do not do that. Is that correct, Charles?
We don't elevate it to that level. It is part of the sign off of code of conduct, yes, as with all other elements of the code of conduct. So you're expected to review the code and acknowledge that you've read it. And
Okay, so they are expected to review it each time that they sign off.
yes.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that answer. Thank you.
I don't see anybody else. So, Councilor Pearson, if you just take a chair for a second, I just want to follow up with you, Charles. If there is an employee who's asked, particularly a senior employee, asked to come to an association event like an annual general meeting and be a guest speaker, and there is a meal provided at it, which is probably more than $25, how would you differentiate that from someone taking an employee out to a nice restaurant for dinner?
Well, that has a clear business purpose, I think, part of doing your job, as opposed to, going, let's say, golfing with vendors, right? It's nothing to do with your actual work. I've been in situations myself where I've been invited to be a speaker, and I'm being, this is in my previous employer. And I remember one instance where I was given, because I was a speaker, was given a book. And as a thank you gift, for attending and speaking at the event. Well, in my opinion, that book belongs to the organization, my employer, which is what I did. You bring that book. I'm being paid by the employer. My employer knows and approves of my speaking at the event. But I'm already being paid by my employer. So that's the case where I think the logical thing to do is to return whatever you receive by way of that type of appreciation to your employer. In the case you're talking about, that's a little different. You can't really return that value, and it's part of your business. It's part of the business or the function of what you do. So I don't see that being exactly in the same vein. But it is admittedly a difficult thing to evaluate in all instances, which is why I think we need some clarity in the policy to remove some of the ambiguities of these questions.
Yeah, I don't think we want to discourage our employees, particularly senior employees, from going and explaining a new policy or a new specification or an update on Randall Reef or an update on the Woodward Avenue sewage treatment plant, because it's good to get that message out to the public. And so I want to make sure this question was asked so that our employees who do that sort of thing are not concerned that they're going to be called to task for it.
Right.
And so is that in our code of conduct that if you're going out to provide to be a speaker at, primarily associations do this, to an association event, that it's an acceptable process?
I don't know if that specific circumstance is cited because the policy, as best I can recall and reflect, is, you know, quite a bit about, you know, defining the various situations in relationships that you can or cannot have that are meant to be closed. So, but to your point, when you're doing that sort of activity, you are undertaking the business of your employer. Whereas if you're just going golfing with a vendor, and more to the point, you're not telling your employer about that. That's a totally different circumstance.
Okay, I appreciate that. And at least we've got it out now that we don't want to discourage our employees from speaking at events by a certain industry group to bring a message to them about what may be transpiring that they should know about. And so I'll take the chair back now, Councillor Pearson. And is there any other questions?
Mr.
Yes,
Chairman?
Councillor Pearson.
Sure, I'll get the chair back, and I'd like to just comment. Charles, thank you so much for your ongoing diligence in delving through this, because it's going to be, you know, it's a work in progress, and we have to keep on top of it. My question, just on the last line of questioning, part of the, I am aware that every year all staff have to sign that their knowledge of our code of conduct, that they've read it and they're aware of it. Is there something maybe that needs to be added in the code of conduct? And I can't remember it. I'm sorry, because I know it's at City Hall in my file, but that assist them in saying, if there's any time that you have a question, similar to just the line of what you're saying, somebody representing the city and doing something in their capacity as their job and doing a presentation and being invited to a dinner, there's something that assists them in saying, you know, this is where you contact if you have questions or concerns and just want clarification of whether it presents, you know, it contravenes the code of conduct. Through you, Mr. Chairman.
Generally speaking, I believe all questions related to the code of conduct are meant to be, will be directed to human resources. I think they're the owner of the policy. And I believe that's fairly clear in the policy. But again, conflicts of interest are just not being reported, or at least disclosure of situations that are potentially, that's what I guess what I'm talking about.
Right.
The disclosure of situations that are potentially a conflict. Well, in order to be evaluated, they need to be disclosed. We're finding too often that a situation, perhaps someone they think in their own mind, oh, there's no conflict, I can be objective. But it's the situation that needs to be reported so that a third party objective person that and adjudicate that situation.
And that was my question, is how do we get that message out? You know, is this an information message? And I see Jeanette Smith's joining us.
Yeah, I was just going to tell you, Jeanette wants to make a comment to this,
Please.
Councillor. So Jeanette, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much through you, Mr. Chair. I think one of the things I had asked Charles to do as we continue to have the hotline is to identify where he's seeing some themes so we can be more proactive and work through. So what I would like to do with this report and this theme that we're seeing, because we've had turnover in staff and et cetera, is to work with the senior leadership team, which includes both HR and communications, to talk through about how we maybe do a CLT meeting with all our directors to kind of walk them through this theme we're seeing, talk through some of the examples about what is fine and what is not. It's contract, it's probably a good time to do as everything starts opening up again with COVID reopening, and just make sure there is that clarity and responsibilities. I think that would be extremely helpful.
And Mr. Chairman, if I can just comment to that, Jeanette, that's really what I was hoping to hear. And I think you're right. This is the perfect timing, and it won't be looked at as offensively from staff, but having the CLT team, because they know their workers, their department heads know, they know what they're being requested to attend, etc. So I think that would be most appropriate, and I think that would be a great step forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, City Manager. I see no more questions or comments, so I first of all need a motion to receive the presentation. Moved by Pearson, seconded by Vanderbeek. Any discussion on that? Seeing none, all in favor? That carries 4-0. And now we need a motion to approve the report. Moved by Johnson, seconded by Pearson. All in favor? That carries unanimously. So let's go now to 8.2, which is the tax rate operating budget variance report as of August the 31st. And so Mike Zagarek, General Manager of Finance and Corporate Services, here to provide committee with the presentation. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good Thursday morning to committee members. I do have a companion presentation to the staff report. That is agenda item 8.2 for agenda today. And happy to take any questions as I go through the presentation, or happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation. Just as a reminder, this is the second of our scheduled 3 variance reports. This variance report takes us to the period of August 31st, forecasting out to the balance of this fiscal year. As in the June variance report, I do want to highlight that while we do not budget for this pandemic, while we didn't set the 2021 budget to reflect the pandemic, that the variance report does reflect the impacts the pandemic has had on city services, demand for city services, and the costs associated with city services. So this morning, I just wanted to provide a bit of a summary to committee members as it relates to our tax and operating budget variances, as well as a short summary as to the COVID funding that the City of Hamilton has been able to secure or have commitments from senior levels of government for 2021, as well as in some cases carrying over to 2022. And finally, just highlighting there are recommendations before you as it relates to agenda item 8.2. Just working from the bottom of this table up, just drawing your attention that for 2021, staff are forecasting a deficit in our rate supported program. Again, just a reminder, rate supported program represents water, wastewater, and stormwater services. Similar to our June variance report, in June we were similarly forecasting a deficit, but some changes in factors contributing to that deficit. As it relates to our tax supported program, staff are forecasting a surplus or favorable variance of approximately 3%, and that translates into just short of $29 million surplus for 2021. Further up in this table, you'll see that city departments are all forecasting favorable variances ranging from 2.5% to 6.7%. And again, COVID is having a significant impact on the demand, utilization, and delivery of city services, but also the level of financial support from senior levels of government is very much supporting the surplus position. Just to illustrate, had the city not been able to leverage federal and provincial support as it relates to 2021, staff would be presenting not a surplus of 29, just short of $29 million, but a deficit of approximately $71.5 million. So again, I'll be speaking shortly to the level of support we received from senior levels of government and how that has contributed to our forecasted financial position for 2021. Further down, you'll see that we are reflecting information as it relates to our boards and agencies. Hamilton Police Services are forecasting a deficit of approximately 0.2% or approximately $400,000. Library, Hamilton Public Library are forecasting a surplus of about 9% or approximately just short of $3 million. And you'll see that the balance of other boards and agencies in the City Enrichment Fund is fairly minor, approximately unfavorable variance, approximately $57,000. And finally, capital financing staff are forecasting a capital financing surplus of approximately 8% or $11 million. And that is principally related to the timing of having to issue debt. As we defer the need to issue debt, we have debt financing savings associated with previously approved capital projects. Just focusing a bit on our tax supported program, just wanting to highlight some factors that are contributing to the our August 31st forecast relative to our June 30th forecast. As it relates to housing services, we're seeing a slightly higher favorable variance surplus, and that is principally related to some recovery programs that the city offers some recoveries that the city realized as it relates to previous funding to housing providers, and I'll speak to that shortly, as well as the decline in the demand for some housing stability benefits that the city offers, and again related to COVID and federal COVID funding that housing clients are able to leverage. Waste management, we're seeing more favorable revenues as it relates to our transfer stations and community recycling centers. And again, this could be related to COVID. I know many of us were cleaning out garages and emptying out closets during the early days of COVID. And so that related to increased demand for these services and some favorable revenues as it relates to these services. Within corporate services, we're forecasting a slightly higher favorable variance, year-end favorable variance driven by some gapping. Gapping represents employee-related savings and some additional revenues around tax certificates. And planning is forecasting a less favorable variance, and that less favorable variance is attributed to development activity and development revenues that are being transferred to the development fee stabilization reserve. And so while this may be interpreted as a negative, it in fact is a positive in that these activities have obligated responsibilities as it relates to transferring those revenues to reserves for the purpose of future demands on those services. And again, that is one of the contributing factors to our August variance. I've just made reference to gapping again for the benefit of the community. The city refers to gapping as it relates to employee-related savings. And while we budget just short of $5 million as it relates to employee-related savings, and in a typical year, we would realize savings because of gaps as it relates to employment, individuals going off on maternity leave, and the time it takes to fill those positions. It could be someone leaving the city of Hamilton, and there's the natural time required to fill those positions between the individual leaving the city of Hamilton and their successor filling that position. And so while we budget approximately $5 million for gapping, you'll see that our forecast for 2021 is significantly greater at approximately 14, just short of $15 million. COVID is very much driving this favorable variance. You'll recall that the City of Hamilton, in effort to ensure the safety of our employees and our citizens, we suspended a number of programs, for instance, in recreation, and that represents a significant contribution you'll see under health and safe communities, but as well as it relates to some direction from council is we SLT made some efforts to try to offset some of the COVID financial impacts, and that might have led to the reduction in students, seasonal hires. So again, COVID very much is having an impact as it relates to this favorable variance, and this favorable variance also represents some challenges. For instance, approximately $1 million of the favorable variance is related to long-term care or long-term care homes where we're having challenges as it relates to filling and recruiting some positions in long-term care services. I'll spend a few minutes going department by department and just highlighting some of the more material observations as it relates to this variance period. For planning economic development, and I should highlight that the numbers that are before you represent net of federal provincial funding. So again, where we have commitments or realized federal and provincial funding as it relates to COVID-19, we've reflected it, the numbers that we presented to you for the purposes of the staff report. $4 million, some additional activity as it relates to planning activity, which is contributing to some favorable revenues of approximately $400,000. And as I spoke to previously, COVID and the restrictions around COVID has contributed to the need to suspend or close some city facilities, and that in part is contributing to tourism's favorable variance of approximately $200,000. Healthy and safe communities is we are forecasting a surplus of approximately $6.5 million, gapping contributing approximately $3 million of that $6.5 million. Housing Services is reporting favorable rent supplements and housing stability benefits of $1.7 million. Important to highlight that the Housing Services clients have been able to leverage federal funding through CERB and other programs, and consequently are not having the same demand on municipal services. So recognizing that this was our experience to date as relates to 2021, some of these federal programs are being amended such that eligibility is being reduced. So again, while this did have a favorable impact in 2021, we are not expecting this to be structural or sustainable going forward. Ministry of Health, long-term care, our long-term care partners have received some additional funding from Ministry of Health over and above what was budgeted for, approximately $1.7 million. Ontario Works, we are forecasting a savings as it relates to some additional subsidy and around the reference to program intake. What that speaks to is COVID has had an impact where there's less demand for some of our programs and placements. And so, again, we're forecasting a favorable variance of approximately $900,000. We're forecasting a Hamilton Paramedic Services to have a deficit of $2.8 million, but important to note that what's driving this is COVID-related expenses, and we do have an application in to the provincial government, and we're just awaiting confirmation from the provincial government for offsetting funding from the provincial government. I would expect that deficit to turn into a surplus if that application is supported. And finally, at the bottom, the last bullet point, just wanting to highlight that in June, we were similarly forecasting a favorable variance for housing services, and council approved appropriating or taking some of that surplus, $1 million of that surplus, to increase the 2021-2022 rent ready program. So again, we saw the opportunity to to realize some of the surplus in housing and to increase the level of support that we may be able to provide in the immediate term to clients through the Rent Ready program. Public Works, we are forecasting a surplus of approximately $9.9 million. Gapping surplus is contributing approximately 4.5 of that $9.9 million. Again, there was a number of Public Works programs that were suspended or where we reduced because of the public health guidelines, the number of employees that we were able to have out in the field safely transporting those employees. So again, approximately $4.5 million in gap in savings. Winter season and roads maintenance, we're seeing a reduction in the number of events in 2021 relative to a normal year, and we're forecasting approximately $2.2 million in related savings. 2/3 of that $2.2 million is related to materials and supplies, and 1/3 of that $2.2 million represents contractual savings. Increased recycling commodity revenues we're seeing in the case of fiber and steel, that the market rates for recyclables is improving, and so we're forecasting a surplus of approximately $1.7 million. I mentioned previously the transfer centers and community recycling centers. We're seeing increase in activity at those facilities and representing some additional tipping fee revenues of approximately $900,000. Transit's reporting a fuel savings of approximately $500,000. You may recall in the earlier days of this pandemic, the decline in the demand for fuel transferred into a lower cost of fuel. Bit of a different situation in our current position, but nonetheless, we are forecasting a $500,000 fuel savings for transit. Corporate services, we're forecasting a $1.1 million surplus. Gapping is a contributing, the principal contributor to that surplus, as well as offsetting that slightly are some additional COVID related expenses, principally around enhanced cleaning. City Manager's Office is forecasting a surplus of approximately $500,000. Again, gapping being the contributing factor to that forecast. Corporate financials, non-program revenues, again, just as a reminder, these are expenditures or revenues that do not naturally fit into a program area and therefore are reported and recorded under corporate financials, non-program revenues. We're projecting a unfavorable variance in some additional WSIB pressures. This represents both physical and mental barriers for employees, and so we're forecasting a unfavorable variance of $4 million. Provincial Offences Act revenues, again, because of the disruption in our court system, we're forecasting a deficit of approximately $2.6 million. This committee may recall some weeks ago, staff brought forward a report identifying insurance premiums, an increased insurance premium costs of approximately $2.1 million. And finally, offsetting some of these pressures is an additional $600,000 in payment in lieu of taxes, which is favorable relative to budget. Boards and agencies, again, Hamilton Police Services is forecasting a unfavorable variance of approximately $400,000. Library, favorable variance of just short of $3 million. And you can see slight variances in other boards and agencies in the City Enrichment Fund. We're forecasting actuals to budget. And again, capital financing, we're forecasting a favorable variance of approximately 8% or $11 million. And this ties to timing of debt and the fact that we are expecting to issue debt later than what was originally assumed or budgeted for. On the rate supported program, you'll see that a bit of a flip from our June report. These were in fact reversed as it relates to expenditures revenues. Staff are forecasting a favorable variance as it relates to expenditures of approximately $1.4 million, and an unfavorable variance as it relates to revenues of approximately $2.8 million, for a net impact of $1.4 million. As it relates to rate revenues, the contributing factor to the unfavorable variance forecast is a deficit in our industrial, commercial, and institutional sector of approximately $4.5 million. There were some significant adjustments made in 2021. This committee may recall one adjustment as it relates to the Barton Jail and a error as it relates to the billing of that facility. Partially offsetting this deficit is a surplus of approximately $2.4 million in the residential sector, as individuals were restricted to either working from home or learning from home. We expect that to be a contributing factor to the $2.4 million favorable variance in that sector. And as it relates to non-rate revenues, we're forecasting a unfavorable variance of approximately $500,000 permits and lease agreements. And this staff are attributing principally due to the issuing of new construction permits being delayed as it relates to the pandemic. Expenditures, again, staff are forecasting $1.4 million favorable position for expenditures, approximately $3.5 million favorable for capital financing. Employee-related costs are estimated to be favorable by approximately $700,000. Contractual expenditures, staff are forecasting an unfavorable variance, largely due to some increased soil testing, as well as some odor control pressures, and finally some inlet and outlet maintenance pressures. And again, that represents approximately $1.5 million as it relates to soils, odors, and outlet maintenance. Building and ground unfavorable variance, mainly due to the increased utility costs at the wastewater treatment plants. And finally, materials and supplies unfavorable due to increased chemical costs. Just going to spend a minute just reminding committee members, you would have seen a table similar to this in our June variance report. As I mentioned at the outset of my presentation, is COVID is represented right through this variance report as it relates to the demand for city services, the cost of city services, and the financial impacts of those changes in demands and costs. As it relates to our forecast for 2021, staff are forecasting COVID-related pressures of approximately $101 million. And you'll see that through the financial support of senior levels of government, we're expecting to almost entirely, at this stage, almost entirely offset that $101 million through federal and provincial funding. You'll see from the far right, the second column from the far right, our current position is approximately just short of $99 million in funding to offset against the $101 million in pressures. I will note that, as I mentioned previously, we have one application that's still outstanding for Hamilton Paramedic Services. So we may actually realize offsetting federal and provincial funding. So as it relates to COVID pressures, just wanting to once again just recognize those contributions from the federal and provincial governments and thank them for their support, not only for 2021, but you'll see through 2022 budget deliberations, some of these funding programs continue on to March of 2022, which will help us into the first quarter of 2022. Some extend to December potentially around transit, can, subject to the minister's approval, extend to the end of December of 2022. So again, just wanting to recognize and thank senior levels of government for their financial support, and hoping that we can still realize that support as we head into 2022 and head into the recovery coming out of the pandemic. You have a series of recommendations that are before you under agenda item 8.2. Just wanting to draw your attention to those recommendations as you receive this presentation and deliberate on the staff reports. And through the chair, happy to take any questions committee members might have and happy to stop sharing this presentation.
Thank you, Mike. Great presentation. There's not a lot of changes from the last update we had. It's nice to see you're proposing a $28 million surplus, which is the great side of the ledger to be on. And I want to thank you and your team and all the city employees for their contributions to help keep us in good financial shape during these difficult times. Is there any questions of Mike? Mike or Councilor Pearson, could you just take the chair for a minute? I just have two questions. Number one is on slide 5, Mike, you talk about a $2.3 million positive variance in commodity prices for our Blue Box program. And that's quite a reversal from what we've experienced over the last number of years where commodity prices have crashed in that area. So I just want to draw attention to that it's nice to see that turnaround coming the other way. I know scrap steel is very expensive and steel is one of the reasons, but I expect aluminum is also doing the same. And our fibers too. Suddenly the newspapers and cardboard is starting to get value again. So I wanted to draw attention to that. And the second is more just for information and clarity, Mike, is on the boards and agencies, Hamilton Police Services is showing a projected $408,000 loss. And a few years ago, council agreed to have police keep surpluses for rainy days, for the lack of a better expression, including a tax stabilization reserve. And so this is, I think, the first time in quite a while they've actually forecasting a negative variance. So will that be funded from their own tax stabilization reserve?
Through the chair, so the councillor's right in his recall of what transpired previous years. In fact, City Council asked Hamilton Police Services Board to establish a series of reserves to provide some transparency as to year-end surpluses and where those surpluses could be applied to. One of those reserves is a tax stabilization reserve, so not to be confused with the City of Hamilton's tax stabilization reserve. So Hamilton Police Services have their own tax stabilization reserve. The purpose of that reserve is to transfer surpluses, or in the case of deficits, to fund those deficits from that reserve. So we would work with our Hamilton Police Services partners through the chair as we approach year end to assess the capacity in that reserve to see whether or not that reserve is sufficient to offset their forecasted deficit, if that deficit by year end translates into an actual year end deficit.
Okay. So do you need any direction from the committee on that? Because it's the first time we experienced that, or are you going to be following up with the Hamilton Police Services on that tax stabilization reserve in their accounts?
Yeah, through the chair, staff don't require any direction or motion. That would be normal practice for us. So again, as we approach year end and as we prepare for the year end report, that'll form part of our discussions with Hamilton Police Services.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll take the chair back. Councillor Pearson, any other questions of committee? And seeing none, I need a mover and a seconder to receive the staff presentation. Moved by Vanderbeek, seconded by Pearson. All in favor, electronic vote.
Mr. Chairman, my e-scribe just went down. Thumbs up. Thank you.
We got it. Thank you. It carries unanimously. Now we also need a mover and a second to approve the report with some recommendations in there. Moved by Vanderbeek, seconded by Johnson. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor. And that carries unanimously. Thanks very much, Mike, for your, once again, thorough presentation and great news on it too. We'll move on. There's no public hearings and delegations. There is no discussion items. There's no motions, but there is one notice of motion. And Councillor Pearson, could you take a chair on this? Because I want to place
Go ahead.
my notice of motion.
Yep.
So it's before you under item 12.1. This is the Ancaster Memorial Arts Center, the fit up costs. And I'd like to move to waive the rules for two reasons. Number one, we met with the contractor about a month ago. And by the way, despite COVID and despite supply chain issues, which has delayed the project, it's expected now that they'll have substantial completion by late February or early March. But with the supply chain issues, the fit-up cost is primarily tables and chairs and projectors, the typical fit-up costs that we would do on any building we do. So I need to raise the rules in order to allow them to start to procure these materials if it is approved by committee. So I'd like to move that we waive the rules. I think Councillor Pearson, you would second that?
I'll second that.
I did have Councillor Clark lined up, but he didn't know about his conflict with NEC today.
Mhm.
Okay, any discussion on waiving the rules? Seeing none, all in favor?
Chair, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
It's okay. I'm hearing myself.
And Councillor Pearson, that carries 4-0.
Thank you. Then, Councillor Ferguson, you want to put your motion?
I will. So this is moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Pearson regarding the Ancaster Memorial Arts Center fit-up cost. And whereas the city is a registered owner of the lands known as former Ancaster Memorial School and municipally known as 357 Wilson Street, Ancaster, Ontario. And whereas the city is pursuing collective initiative with local arts community for the redevelopment of the former Ancaster Memorial School to develop a center for the community artistic expression. Whereas the Ancaster Society for the Performing Arts has been leading the collective effort of 12 community arts groups on a major capital campaign to raise capital funds to assist in development of the Arts Center in the former Ancaster Memorial School. And whereas in accordance with 9.2 General Issues Committee Report 1715 adopted by City Council on July 14th, the city has agreed to lease the Ancaster Society for Memorial Arts Performing Arts Corporation, the former Ancaster Memorial School. And whereas the lease agreement provides that the Ancaster Society for the Planning for Performing Arts Corporation is responsible for the furniture and fixture requirements of the facility, and whereas the Ancaster Society for the Performing Arts Corporation has requested that the city provide support for the purchase of furniture and fixtures of the facility, and whereas the city of Hamilton has previously authorized establishment of forgivable loans, one being the Dr. Kim Hospice through report FCS 10092. Therefore, be resolved that the General Manager of Finance and Corporate Services be authorized to enter into a forgivable loan with terms and conditions satisfactory to the General Manager of Finance, Corporate Services, and the city solicitor to a maximum of $385,000 to support the purchase of furnishings and fixtures for the facility to be funded from the Investment Stabilization Reserve. And then in addition to the terms and conditions that the General Manager of Finance Corporate Service may identify, the forgivable loan agreement shall include a condition that the Ancaster Society for the Performing Arts Corporation continue to operate the facility at 357 Wilson Street in compliance with the full term, 10 years of the lease agreement between the city and the Ancaster Society for the Performing Arts. And a condition that the Ancaster Society for the Performing Arts Corporation provide annual financial statements and other related financial information that demonstrates the financial capacity of the organization to the city to the satisfaction of the GM of Finance and Corporate Services. And the forgivable loan be contingent upon compliance with the terms and conditions with the lease agreement between the city and Ancaster Society for the Performing Arts. And just that pretty well explains the motion, but I would like to remind everyone that remember the province pulled out their funding of this just before we were ready to proceed because of the change in government. So the Ancaster Society for the Performing Arts went out to the community and were successful in raising $5 million towards the capital cost. And, we discovered that the fit-up costs were not included in the original budget. And of course, you can't open the facility without tables and chairs. So I would appreciate everyone's support on this motion. And it's moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Pearson.
Thank you, Councillor Ferguson. I have Councillor Vanderbeek wishing to ask a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question was just answered. It was going to be, I was going to ask how much the society had actually raised toward this project. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Seeing no further speakers, then I'll ask everyone to please vote electronically.
And that vote carries 4-0.
Thank you,
Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Yep.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Councillor Pearson, for seconding the motion. So I'll move
Very
on. There's
based.
no general information or other business. And just gonna flip the page. Closed session minutes. Can I have a mover or seconder to approve the closed session minutes of the November 4th, 2021 meeting? Moved by Johnson, seconded by Pearson. No discussion on them? Seeing none, all in favor? And that carries unanimously. And on item 14, Information Security Program Capital Project, does the committee wish to go into closed session to discuss item 14.2? Okay, seeing none. So I think, Madam Clerk, I'm just going to see if I got some roadmap directions when we don't go into camera.
So through the chair, it's an information report, so it would be just to receive and remain confidential, but it's on page 6. Sorry, my apologies. On page 7.
Okay, can I have a mover and a seconder then to receive the report? Moved by Pearson, seconded by Johnson. Discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? And that carries unanimously. So we just need a motion to adjourn. Moved by Councillor Pearson, Councillor Vanderbeek, all in favor? And that carries unanimously. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good job. Thanks,
Thank you.
Angela.
Thank you, everyone.